Good evening, everybody. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and we're thrilled tonight to welcome a man who has held too many positions to know which honorific to use. So I will just say the very honorable Leon Panetta, who will be in conversation with a broadcast journalist who is no stranger to our audience, the legendary Larry Mantle. I welcome you on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., the creators and hosts of this series, and our leadership team, Zev Yaroslavsky, Mel Levine, Rabbi Ken Chazen, Caroline Kelly, David Lehrer, and myself. Thank you to our many wonderful co-sponsors, Temple Isaiah, Stephen Wise Temple, Valley Beth Shalom, Temple Beth Am, Leo Beck Temple, IKAR, Temple Israel of Hollywood, Jewish Center for Justice, the Holocaust Museum LA, the Forward, and the Pico Union Project. Tomorrow night is the first night of Hanukkah. I recently came across a Talmudic debate between two famous ancient rabbinic houses, Hillel and Shammai, about how to light the menorah. Shammai argued that we should light all 8 candles on the first night and each night decrease the number of lights so that on the 8th night we light only 1 candle. He argued that our lighting should parallel the story about the miracle of the oil that was only supposed to last for 1 night, but it lasted for 8. So that we'd have diminishing quantities each day. But it was the house of Hillel that prevailed, and for the last more than 2,000 years, since 165 BCE, Jews light 1 additional candle each night until there are 8 on the last night of Hanukkah. Each night we move on a forward trajectory, bringing more light as we progress through the holiday. The historical details of the Hanukkah story are about anti-Semitism, efforts to Hellenize Jews, about the military might on a David and Goliath scale. But the bigger message of Hanukkah is about the struggle for justice despite obstacles. It's about the triumph of freedom over oppression. Hanukkah tells us of the value of our willingness to engage in the eternal struggle, to overcome intolerance and to pursue justice and multiculturalism, to hold on to the hope that the future can be brighter than the past. That's why we add a candle to our menorah each night. That message is very relevant to both Jews United and to community advocates and to all of our co-sponsors of this program who work diligently to bend the arc towards a more inclusive society, which respects all cultures and all people. So we wish you all a happy Hanukkah, and we urge you to join us next Tuesday night, the next Tuesday night of Hanukkah, for a program which embodies the deepest aspirations of Hanukkah. How can we move from 4 years of bigotry, tension, and racial divide to a better, more enlightened social order? We have assembled an outstanding panel of top national leaders of Jewish, Muslim, Hispanic, Black, and Asian communities for a discussion entitled 4 Years of Bigotry, Tension, and Division, How Do We Heal? We will welcome Jonathan Greenblatt of the Anti-Defamation League, Derek Johnson of the NAACP, Cindy Benavides of the League of United Latin Americans, Salam Al-Mariyati of the Muslim Public Affairs Council, and Kathy Cochin of the Asian American Health Forum. Our moderator will be our own David Lehrer, former Western States Director of the ADL, founder of Community Advocates, and a member of the Judge Leadership Team. And don't forget, it's Tuesday next week, not Wednesday. Now, for a few additional announcements before we begin our program, please welcome the great David Lehrer.
Thank you, Janice. It's a pleasure to be here and to join you in welcoming everyone to another of our America at Crossroads virtual town halls. This is the 34th in our weekly series that started in mid-April. Our programming over the next month and a half is continuing at the level to which you've all become accustomed. Janice has mentioned next week's program. In 2 weeks, on December 23rd, we'll close out the year with New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist Bret Stephens to offer his always probing insights. Next month also promises an exciting series of evenings. On January 6th, we'll present the superstar couple of political journalism, Peter Baker, chief White House correspondent of the New York Times, and his wife, Susan Glasser, the New Yorker's Letter from Trump's Washington columnist. The following week, we have the head of Los Angeles County's Health Department, Dr. Barbara Farrar, to talk about the delivery of the COVID vaccination in large urban centers and across the country, what to expect and how it will happen. On Inauguration Eve, January 19th, a Tuesday, we'll have a trio of mavens on election law and how it must be changed. Ben Ginsberg, former Republican National Committee counsel, will join one of the nation's leading experts on election law, Professor Rick Hasson of UC Irvine's Law School, along with National Public Radio's election expert, Pam Fessler. Finally, on January 27th, we'll have Jacob Soboroff, an NBC and MSNBC correspondent who was one of the first reporters to call public attention to the Trump administration's family separation policy. He's the author of Separated, a New York Times bestseller about what the Trump administration did and is still doing to hundreds of immigrant children. It promises to be a great few weeks of programming. It's now my pleasure to introduce a longtime friend, a decades-long leader in this community, a former congressman, and an indefatigable leader in this series special, the ever-youthful Mel Levine.
Thank you to the ever-youthful David Lair. And I want to salute and thank David and Janice for their tireless work in not only overseeing this series, but everything else that they do, basically along these lines. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce Leon Panetta. I was trying to flash back on exactly how many decades Leon and I have been friends. I think I first met Leon in 1965. If it wasn't in 65, it was near then. And to flash on one aspect of how different things were at that time from today, when Leon and I first met, we were both Republicans. Leon was the legislative assistant to California's liberal Republican Senator Thomas Kuechel, who was a strong supporter of civil rights and a liberal Republican who would be aghast at what has happened to his once moderate to liberal political party. My father was a very close friend of the senator's, and as a result of that, I used to get to hang around his office a lot and spend a lot of time with him. And I remember vividly hearing from Senator Kuechel, who was very fond of Leon, that what Leon really wanted to do was one day go home and get elected to Congress from his district. And about 10 years after the senator shared that with me, Leon did just that. He returned to Monterey and he was elected to Congress, where he served with great distinction for 16 years. And after a few years of hiatus, that district is now represented by Leon's son, Jimmy Panetta. I had the privilege of serving with Leon in the House, and I saw firsthand his effectiveness and his influence and the respect and affection with which he was held across party lines and throughout both caucuses with enormous regard by his colleagues, including, I might say, by me. Leon became a master of the federal budget, and he became chair of the House Budget Committee. And after those 16 years in Congress, largely, I think, as a result of his extraordinary knowledge of the budget, but also because of his overall effectiveness and the respect with which he was held, President Clinton named Leon director of the Office of Management and Budget. After serving in that capacity, as Janice mentioned, he has many titles. He became chief of staff to President Clinton. And in the Obama presidency, Leon served first as director of the Central Intelligence Agency and subsequently as Secretary of Defense. Leon and his super talented wife, Sylvia, started the Panetta Institute in Monterey, which is dedicated to motivating and preparing people for lives in public service and helping them to become more knowledgeably engaged in the democratic process. I actually think Leon might offer Donald Trump a lesson in that regard. There is probably no single American who has the vast and diverse governmental experience of Leon Panetta. And to interview Leon, we are thrilled to welcome back Larry Mantle, a Los Angeles treasure who has expertly moderated many of our programs already. Larry has been the host of Air Talk with Larry Mantle on NPR member station KPCC for 35 years. Air Talk is the longest running daily show in Southern California and has served as KPCC's flagship program for most of its tenure. Larry also hosts the movie review and interview program Film Week on Air Talk. Larry has received many awards for his journalism excellence, including the Society of Professional Journalists Radio Journalist of the Year Award and the Associated Press's prestigious Mark Twain Award. Larry, the floor is yours.
Mel, thank you so much. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be back and later on this hour to get the terrific questions that come from those who attend America at the Crossroads. I'm always so impressed with the input that we get from those of you that are here not just weekly, but however often you're able to come to these outstanding programs that judge and community advocates have put together. It's such a pleasure to be asked to participate in them, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation with Secretary Panetta this evening. I do want to mention that we are soliciting your questions. You can ask them in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. Please include your first name if you wouldn't mind, because it's nice if I'm able to reference your first name and where you're watching this. So the city, or if you're in a particularly large city like Los Angeles, the district of the city that you're in. It just gives a nice sense of place for everybody else. Secretary Panetta is so perfectly experienced to talk about our issue of the transition from the Trump to the Biden presidency. Given his positions as chief of staff and directing the Office of Management and Budget, he's seen the inner workings as well, of course, have been in very high profile positions like Secretary of Defense and of course, directing the CIA. So without any further delay, Secretary Panetta, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Let's start with what we're not seeing beneath the tip of the iceberg. So we see a lot of news each day. We hear a lot about what's happening with the transition process. President-elect Biden, of course, naming already a large portion of his cabinet. We understand that there have been meetings between the outgoing and the incoming administrations. But what are we not seeing? What are the kinds of conversations, either within the United States or even with leaders abroad, that are probably taking place?
Well, again, thank you, Larry, and my thanks to all of those that put this wonderful town hall series together. And I also want to thank Mel Levine, who was a dear friend, served with him in the Congress, and known him, as he pointed out, for a large number of years. But I thank him for his service to the country, and thank all of you for putting a program like this together, where you can have this kind of discussion about the issues that are impacting on our democracy and on our world. Look, this is no transition that I have ever seen. I've been through a number of transitions. Normally, they have been friendly transitions from the Bush administration to the Clinton administration. There were numerous discussions that were made. There were binders that were developed for each of the departments and agencies. Intelligence was shared on issues on the various areas that were being covered by the departments and agencies. There was a friendly discussion. When I became OMB director, I sat down with my predecessor, Dick Darman, had a long conversation about the challenges that we were facing with regards to the budget. Good conversation. He was very supportive. And the same thing was true when I became CIA director. Bush administration at that time, Bush #2, was very organized and very supportive, preparing obviously all kinds of background materials plus briefings. I went through a number of briefings with people from the CIA who came down to the transition headquarters and briefed me on every area that I would be responsible for, plus the various threats that we were confronting in the world. And that prepared me for the job. I was able to hit the ground running. I don't, for all of the discussion about some of the meetings that are taking place, this is not a very good transition at all, largely because we have a president who doesn't even admit that we should have a transition. So if you got a president who's basically saying that he won the election, he has not conceded, the message being sent to the people in his administration is, you shouldn't be cooperating that much with the new administration. So thankfully, the GAO had finally came to the conclusion that we ought to have some kind of transition. And there have been discussions, there have been meetings that have gone on. But I have to tell you, the reports that I'm getting are that those briefings are not very informative. In many ways, they're conflicting in terms of the views that are being presented. There are many people that are hesitating to share important information with the new team. And so the bottom line is that this is not going to be a very good transition for the new administration.
What does that mean then for all these departments that have to have a transition in leadership? Are the kinds of services they provide, whether it's intelligence, whether it's health and human services, whether it's education, are all of these things going to end up delayed in conforming to the new administration's priorities as a result of this?
Well, the key right now is that Joe Biden is largely appointing people of experience and qualifications who know the job that they're getting into. And as a result of that, you're not starting from scratch. You're not starting with somebody that absolutely does not understand what the role of that agency or department or area is all about. And so experience is going to help here. But there is going to be a gap, because even though you may be experienced, you're going to suddenly walk into EPA or the Justice Department or CIA or any of the other departments and agencies that are there. And you won't know, frankly, how many landmines have been buried in that department in terms of issues that are suddenly going to explode on you and that you're going to have to confront. Because none of that information has been provided. So there is going to be a period of time. Look, under the best of circumstances, it takes at least 3 to 6 months to be able to get the people that you need in place. The assistant secretaries, the deputies, the various heads of different agencies, to go through the personnel process, to go through the confirmation process, just takes a hell of a lot of time. That's under the best of circumstances. So you're going to have a big problem getting your team in place. There is going to be a gap. That's what I'm saying, in which a lot of things are going to be very difficult in terms of being able to transition.
We heard about some career staff members of some of these departments who retired early or who left because they were unhappy with the direction of President Trump's nominees who ended up being confirmed to head these agencies and departments. So is there a chance some of those people might come back? Is that going to mean that some of the newer staff is going to be resistant to a Democratic president? What do you anticipate?
Well, there's going to be an uncomfortable period here. I'm sure there are some people of goodwill who really do want to provide information. And I'm sure there are some that will find ways to provide that information once the new administration goes into office. But there's going to be an attitude of distrust about, the people that are working within these departments and agencies. Let's face it, the last 4 years have been a disaster in terms of the various civil servants who are responsible for policy areas. I mean, you can imagine at EPA as an example, instead of an EPA that is protecting our environment, protecting our country, it's been an EPA that has basically been cutting back on regulations and on rules and basically cutting back on the very steps you need to take in order to provide a strong environment. So the employees there, there's going to be a period of time when you're not sure you can trust anybody in some of these departments. That won't be true across the board, but there will be some that will be very distrustful. If I was going in as a new secretary, my first my first approach would be to get rid of people that are heads of the different departments and sub-agencies, get rid of them so that I can begin to put my people in place so that I can trust what's happening in each of these areas. There's going to be a very difficult time of trying to adjust and trying to develop a trusting relationship with the people that are working for you so you can get your department or agency to do the job that the American people expect.
Secretary Panetta, what is the potential risk in terms of the U.S.'s international relations, given the balkiness of this transition, President Trump's continuous combativeness around the election results? In what ways does that hinder Joe Biden's ability to establish himself with American allies?
Well, the advantage again is that Joe Biden has been around for a number of years. I've known Joe Biden for 40 years, working with him in the Senate, and then obviously working with him as vice president. And he's someone who has spent a lot of time on foreign affairs issues and going around the world, meeting with world leaders. So it's not as if he's somebody who isn't well versed in the challenges that we're facing in the world. He is somebody who knows the issues, knows the challenges, and knows the players that are out there. Having said that, the problem is, he's just begun to get intelligence briefings with regards to what's going on the various threats that are out there. And he's not probably getting the full panoply of deals that have been made abroad in various areas that are going to impact on our relationships with different countries. There are countries that are going to say the Trump administration promised this, the Trump administration promised that, and we've been relying on that, and the new administration probably will know nothing about that. So there's going to be a period of time in which ultimately what the president has to do is to be able to get the State Department, and that's another problem we have because the State Department has largely been hollowed out in terms of experienced personnel. So what your hope is that the new Secretary of State can begin to fill those positions with experienced people so that they can then go out and determine just exactly what did the Trump administration do or not do in these various countries that is impacting on our relationship with our allies and with our adversaries as well. It's going to have to be a long period of trying to get better intelligence as to what took place these last 4 years and how do we deal with that in a new administration.
What changes do you anticipate seeing in U.S. international relations under a Biden administration, specifically regarding Middle Eastern nations, regarding Russia, China? How are those relationships going to change from what we've seen over the past 4 years?
Well, there's going to be a fundamental change in terms of the United States and our approach to world leadership. For the last 4 years, we've had a president who basically has not wanted to exert world leadership. Rather, he's wanted to, in large measure, withdraw from many areas of the world, undermine our alliances, and basically hide in an America First isolationism. And the consequence of that is that the United States has left a huge vacuum in the world that has been filled by our adversaries, by Russia and by China, and filled by other nations trying to at least fulfill a role of leadership there that the United States had performed in the past. So the difference is going to be that Joe Biden will try to restore the United States as a world leader. He's made that clear. I think that's important. I'm someone that supports world leadership on the part of the United States. Very frankly, if the United States is not leading, nobody else will. That's the reality of the world that we're dealing with. So I'm hoping that he will provide world leadership, that he will make clear that we will support and strengthen our alliances in the world, something that Trump was not willing to do. I hope that with regards to the Middle East, that Joe Biden understands that we've got to work with our allies in that region as well, with Israel and with the moderate Arab nations, because we're confronting common threats from terrorism and from Iran and from instability, very frankly, in the Middle East. What we're going to see is that we are going to return, I think, to the role that the United States has played in the world since the end of World War II, which is to work with our allies to try to provide for the security that we have to provide if we're going to be able to confront the adversaries and enemies that exist out there in the world. I'm hopeful that we will have better leadership when it comes to the world. Now, look, Joe Biden is going to be consumed by COVID-19. We are in a disastrous crisis with COVID-19. He's going to be consumed by an economy that's in a recession. So there's no question his main focus is going to be on COVID-19, on a recession, on trying to provide jobs to the American people. But my hope is that the combination of what he says in line with people in key departments will be able to ultimately begin to restore our relationship abroad.
Secretary Panetta, let's talk about the cabinet that the president-elect is very rapidly assembling. And the majority of those need Senate approval of those nominations. Some of them are choices that he can make unilaterally. What sort of difficulties do you anticipate, if any, with some of the nominees?
Well, what happens in Georgia will tell us a hell of a lot about how much trouble he's going to confront. I mean, if the Democrats are able to squeeze control of the Senate, it'll make it a hell of a lot easier to be able to get your nominees confirmed because you'll be working with a Democratic majority. It'll be pretty thin, but nevertheless, it'll be a majority. If that isn't the case, and if the Republicans maintain control of the Senate, then there's no question it's going to be more difficult to be able to get these nominees through. The confirmation process has gotten more difficult over the last number of years. I mean, I've gone through the confirmation process. And just the process of going through it, getting the background checks, getting all of the questions answered, making sure that you know all of the questions that are going to be asked. There's a lot of preparation that's involved here. But now you're walking into a polarized Washington in which you've had both Democrats and Republicans at each other's throats for a long time. And we've seen it. I mean, look, Washington has been dysfunctional because of that polarization and that political divide. And the result is going to be that, Republicans are going to try to target some of these candidates and go after them. I mean, there are some, I think, that are of a stature that they will be approved. And I would think a majority of them will ultimately be approved. But because of the politics of the time, I think it's going to take a while. And some of these candidates are going to face some tough challenges in the nomination process. What Joe Biden's going to have to do is to have a long talk with the majority leader, Mitch McConnell, if he is the majority leader, and try to determine where he can brace the Republicans and the Democrats in order to be able to put his team in place. This is going to be a tough challenge. This is not going to be easy.
We should mention that you were confirmed unanimously, as I recall. So you didn't have to go through the grinder that so many of these people are going to go through in the coming weeks. Secretary Panetta, you mentioned about talking with Mitch McConnell, and one of the things that Joe Biden brings to the presidency is this affability, a gregariousness. Someone he loves talking with people. Anyone who's ever met him, can tell you that his personality just comes through so strongly. So, is he going to be able to effectively use that personality to tamp down some of the partisanship, to be able to reach across the aisle to Republicans? Or are we in such a polarizing environment that what he did during the Obama administration, when he quite effectively served that role, that it'll be much tougher as president?
Larry, I don't think there's any question that this is going to be probably the principal challenge that will face the new president. I've often said that in my 50 years of public service, I've seen Washington at its best, and I've seen Washington at its worst. The good news is I've seen Washington work. When I first went back to Washington to work with Tom Kuechel, he was the minority whip under Everett Dirksen. There were other moderate Republicans, Jacob Javits from New York, Clifford Case from New Jersey, George Aiken from Vermont, Mark Hatfield from Oregon, and they worked with statesmen on the Democratic side, people like Hubert Humphrey, Symington, Dick Russell, Fulbright, Jackson, Magnuson. And even though they had their political differences, they worked together on major issues facing the country. A lot of landmark legislation was passed. When I first got elected to Congress, Tip O'Neill was the speaker, a Democrat's Democrat from Boston. But he had a very good relationship with Bob Michel, who was the minority leader from Illinois. Did they have their political disputes? Of course. But when it came to big issues, they worked together. They felt that it was important to work together to govern the country. And whether it was a Democratic president or a Republican president, they got things done. Under Ronald Reagan, they passed huge tax reform on a bipartisan basis. They passed immigration reform on a bipartisan basis. They passed Social Security reform, for God's sakes, on a bipartisan basis. And that was my history of working with Republicans to try to solve problems. The last number of years, I've never seen Washington more divided and more partisan and more unable to come together to work on key issues. And we've seen that. We've seen that happen on this COVID package, which is critical for the country. They're having a difficult time putting those pieces together. We've seen them fail on immigration reform. We've seen them fail on tax reform. We've seen them fail on infrastructure funding. We've seen them fail on the ability to pass a decent budget that can deal with this huge debt that this country is facing. So there's a number of areas where they have not come together. We have got to learn and get back to governing. That's going to be Joe Biden's challenge. How do we get the Congress back to governing? He is a legislator's legislator. He is somebody who has, throughout his history, worked together with people across the aisle to get legislation passed. That's the Joe Biden I knew. I worked with him when he was a senator. I worked with him when I was in the administration, the Clinton administration. He was somebody who would go to work and get things done. Now, he'll try to do that. He'll try to build relationships. I think the key, frankly, is that he ought to start the new session looking at areas where he can build some bipartisan support, whether it's a COVID-19 aid package, build bipartisan support to get that package through. If it means dealing with trying to assist an economy in recession with assistance, make that on a bipartisan basis. Do infrastructure funding, for goodness sakes, something everybody supports and has been talking about at least for the last 10 years. It's about time both Republicans and Democrats came together on infrastructure. So my point is, come together on some key things and show the country that you can govern. If Joe Biden can do that, he can start his administration on the right track.
Do you think that there is any space on immigration to do that with DACA expansion, things like that? Or is that coming out of the Trump administration just too red hot to be able to accomplish something there?
No, I think that's one of the areas where you can build some bipartisan support. Everybody knows the immigration system is broken. Everybody knows we should have passed immigration reform almost 10 years ago. John McCain certainly tried to pass a bipartisan immigration bill. When I was in the Congress in the 1980s, we passed immigration reform in the Reagan administration, negotiating a package across the aisle, and each of the pieces related to immigration reform, we were able to pull together, and we passed it on a bipartisan basis. I think that President Biden can make that one of his objectives. Using DACA, there's a lot of bipartisan support for these DACA kids. And I think I would use that as one of the key areas to include in a broad immigration reform bill. If Joe can get some of those kinds of reforms adopted, then I think both Republicans and Democrats will understand that they can govern the country. They can work together. Yes, they're going to have their political differences. Yes, they're going to fight on other issues. I understand that. But for goodness sakes, roll up your sleeves and deal with the business of the country.
Secretary Panetta, we have so many questions, outstanding ones from those that are viewing. So I'm going to try and go as rapid paced as we can to get to as many of these in our remaining time. Diane asks, what do you think of President-elect Biden's choice for Secretary of Defense, who was announced today?
As Secretary of Defense, I know Lloyd Austin. He's an outstanding commander. He was commander of U.S. forces in Iraq. He was Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. He was a CENTCOM commander who dealt with Middle East issues. CENTCOM deals with all of the tough challenges, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan or Iran in the Middle East. He is a leader of the highest character and of the highest integrity. I think he'll make a good Secretary of Defense. Now, let me say that I'm concerned about the area of having a civilian leader at DOD. I am a believer that we ought to have civilian leadership at DOD and that we need civilian oversight that was built into the law. The law does, however, provide for a waiver. A waiver was granted for Jim Mattis to become Secretary of Defense. I find it difficult to say that it's okay for Jim Mattis to get a waiver and not okay for the first Black Secretary of Defense to not get a waiver as well.
So you would vote for a waiver if you were in the position to do so?
I would, but I will tell you this, that I think the Congress ought to seriously consider getting rid of the waiver that they're allowed to make, because I really do believe that future presidents ought to appoint civilian secretaries of defense.
All right. Let's see. We have Marcia in the Fairfax district of Los Angeles. Of the other cabinet choices, what do you think of them generally? They're certainly historically diverse. What do you think about the skill, the experience level of the team he's building?
I think Joe Biden is doing what he promised to do, which is to obviously appoint experienced and qualified people who are part of a team and are going to work with him as President of the United States. And I think that diversity is great. I think having Janet Yellen at Treasury is great. He's appointed a Hispanic at Homeland Security. He's now appointed a Black as Secretary of Defense. He's got a number of other positions to complete, but the people that he's picking, I think, are qualified and experienced and people who have worked in the job. These are not people that are going to have to learn the job on the job and understand what the hell they're responsible for. They're people that know the job. And Joe, they are low key. They're not what you would call people who, have high stature in terms of their performance and the country, but that's okay. It can be low key if they do the job that they're responsible for. And I think that part of it will be accomplished in a Biden administration.
Well, and our Attorney General in California, Javier Becerra, sure
right.
raised his profile with the multitudinous lawsuits against the Trump administration over the past 4 years. The Choice for Health and Human Services, of course, as
Mel,
well.
Yeah, Mel and I both know Javier very well. Javier Becerra is a great leader. I think he's very devoted and worked on healthcare issues when he was in the Congress. And obviously dealt with them even in the Attorney General's job. I think he will be an outstanding HHS secretary.
Mark in Short Hills, New Jersey asks, how will President Biden's policies differ from President Trump's when it comes to relating to China?
Good question. I think that, the problem that I've seen these last 4 years is that our adversaries have sensed weakness on the part of the United States. I think that's certainly true for Russia. And as a result of that, Russia has taken advantage of it. Putin felt he could get away with going into the Crimea, going into the Ukraine, going into Syria, conducting election interference in our country. And I think the same thing is true for China. China sensed that the United States was not strong and was not putting the lines in place that needed to be put in place with China. And so, we went through a trade war. We went through a period where, we were basically hurting our own economy in the conflict with China. But more importantly, by virtue of not providing world leadership, not dealing with other Asian countries, not trading with other nation countries. I mean, the first thing that Trump did is walk away from the TTP, the trade agreement that Barack Obama had worked out with Asian countries. And what happened? China went into that vacuum and has taken advantage of it. And they've gone into the vacuum wherever the United States is not around. So I think what you will see is that Joe Biden is going to be tough with China, is going to make clear where the lines are, certainly with regards to the South China Sea and our ability to transit that area under freedom of the seas. I think he'll be tough with China on Hong Kong, on Taiwan. I think he'll be tough in terms of trade discussions. The difference will be that he will also be willing to conduct dialogue with the Chinese. And I think that is frankly what's been missing. You can be tough with China, but at the same time, you ought to leave your communication lines open with the Chinese so that you can work out issues that relate to not just trade, but to our economy and to our relationship in general. Be tough with them on their human rights record. Be tough with them in terms of what they're trying to do militarily. Be tough with them in terms of drawing lines that they cannot cross, that they've got to abide by international rules. But at the same time, be willing to sit down and have that dialogue so that ultimately you can try to resolve some of these issues on a negotiated basis.
Carol in Bloomfield, Michigan asks, what is your assessment of the risk to Americans of domestic extremist groups?
I think that they have been empowered these last 4 years. That unfortunately, we've had a president who did not deliver a strong message that extremism in our society is unacceptable and that it will not be tolerated. Instead, he almost empowered them through the comments that he made. And the result is that these extremist groups have become, I believe, more dangerous. And we've seen some of that in some of the disruptions that have taken place, what happened in Michigan, what's happened in Oregon and elsewhere. And we've seen the growth of anti-Semitism as a result of these extremist groups. It's become a threat to our ability to be able to preserve the freedoms and equality that are part of the United States. I think the new Justice Department is going to have their hands full if they're going to be willing to confront these kinds of groups and enforce the law against them. And the president has to be very clear that that kind of extremism will not be tolerated in our American democracy, and pursue those groups that threaten others in our society.
Secretary Panetta, Ephraim in Florida asks, do you think the U.S. should rejoin the Iran agreement?
I think what I sense from what Joe Biden is saying is that he will try to reestablish our relationship with the allies who negotiated the agreement. Great Britain, France, Germany, China, Russia, and try to work with our allies to make clear that we are unified in our approach to these negotiations, and that there have to be some very clear preconditions that Iran must accept if they are going to negotiate. And preconditions are that they have to come within the limits that were established in terms of nuclear enrichment, and that they have to be willing to deal with the issue of missile development and the issue of supporting terrorism and instability in the Middle East. And look, who knows whether Iran will agree to those terms. But I think that if we are to have negotiations on the issues that we're concerned about, that we have to make clear that Iran has to meet those conditions before we will agree to negotiations.
Secretary Panetta, Deborah in Eustis, Florida asks what you think about proposals to expand the size of the Supreme Court.
I frankly do not support that. I think 9 justices, what we have in the Supreme Court. I remember Franklin Delano Roosevelt, frustrated by a Supreme Court that was not accepting elements of the New Deal, tried to increase the number in the Supreme Court, and the Congress refused to go along with that. I think the key, frankly, is to begin the process of again appointing qualified, balanced jurists to the court, beginning at the district court level, the circuit court level, and working your way up to ultimately Supreme Court positions. That's what ultimately has to happen, is we have got to begin to put in place judges and jurists who are not coming from a political extreme on the left or on the right, but are people who will view the law in an unbiased and experienced way and in a balanced way. We need to get back to judges being judges, not being political hacks.
Stu in Santa Monica asks, do you think Biden will get along with Benjamin Netanyahu?
I think he will. I've seen him, sit down with Netanyahu when he came to this country. I've seen him visit Israel and be with Netanyahu, and they have a pretty good relationship. I think as always, we're not going to agree on everything. That's the nature of being good friends, is that, you talk through your differences, you talk through the concerns you have, but you talk with each other and you work with each other. And I think that's what Joe Biden will do. Joe Biden believes deeply in the bond that we have with Israel. I think he believes deeply that we need to continue to support that alliance. They are the one country that is a democracy in that part of the world. We face some common threats with Israel in that part of the world. So there are a number of areas where we need to continue to work together. I have to tell you, as CIA director, my ability to work with my intelligence counterparts in Israel, as Secretary of Defense, my ability to work with defense ministers in Israel was incredibly important to our ability to maintain security and maintain our national security interests. I think that's what Joe Biden will continue to do.
We have a question from PF who asks, how do you think President Trump will affect the Biden administration in the coming years? And I guess a lot of that depends on what role the soon-to-be former president takes. Is he going to be a constant critic, tweeting, criticizing the president? Will members of his party continue to follow his lead? So there are a lot of ifs there, but what do you think is the potential there?
Larry, when Trump got elected, I was obviously very concerned about his election. But I also felt that, once having been there, once somebody walks into the Oval Office and understands the tremendous responsibility of the President of the United States, that person, no matter what their particular background, understands that they've got to assume those responsibilities and learn the presidency. And I thought, as bad as he was, that ultimately, in order to understand the importance of establishing a legacy for himself, that he would be willing to learn, be willing to listen to people, be willing to get good people around him, and do the job of being president of the United States. That hasn't happened. He's done just the opposite. He doesn't want to listen to anybody. He doesn't want to read the intelligence bulletins that are provided. He doesn't want to bring in people who may know more about an issue that he knows nothing about. He doesn't respect other people who come in and give him guidance and advice. He doesn't change. He doesn't change. And so I suspect that a Trump who eventually is dragged out of the White House is not going to be somebody who's going to change. He's going to continue to say he was robbed in the election. He's going to continue to try to be antagonistic towards President Biden. He's going to try to establish some kind of continuing political base that he can continue to try to dominate the Republican Party. I think the Republican Party is going to have to face a very fundamental decision. Are they going to continue to be disciples of Trump, no matter what the hell he says or does? Or are they finally going to try to break away and establish a Republican Party that can stand on its own and be true, frankly, to the principles of the Republican Party that, I thought were important for the past. I mean, I think it's important to have a strong two-party system, but I think to have a party in which a large number of members are basically saying that Joe Biden has not been elected president of the United States is scary. It's scary. And it tells me that, no matter what we try to do, that the balance of power is broken because we have a party that is not willing to face the truth. You can believe what you want to believe, but at least acknowledge the truth, for God's sakes.
Secretary Panetta, when you say you believe in a strong two-party system, I wonder how many Democratic leaders agree to the value of that, that having two strong parties that have to compromise, that have to forge alliances, that is in the best interests of the country. Because so often what we hear is it seems that people believe, well, if only our party ran things, it would all be better. Do you think that the attitude that you hold has shifted?
Yeah, I think it's going to take a while. You know, it took a while to get to this point of division and polarization. And I think it's going to take a while to get back to a process where both sides can sit down, listen to one another, be civil with one another, recognize the truth. I mean, you can't govern if you can't at least agree on what the facts are. But if we can get back to that, that goes to the heart of governing in our democracy, for goodness sakes. I mean, look, you know, you can't slam dunk anything in a democracy. I'm sure there are a lot of people that would love to be able to slam dunk something. You can't. And every president who walks into the Oval Office finds out that you can't ultimately dictate something that's going to happen without going through the process that our forefathers established. And the ability to govern requires that there be two sides who understand that there is a problem. They may have different approaches, but are willing to talk with one another and find consensus, find compromise. That goes to the heart of how our democracy functions. And, you know, I think the challenge for Joe Biden, I think the challenge for Democrats and Republicans is whether they're going to get back to governing or whether they're simply going to fight each other, to stop each other in their tracks, and to worry more about protecting their seat than protecting the country. That's going to be a fundamental question that will determine, frankly, the fate of our democracy.
Secretary Panetta, thank you so much for answering all these questions from people attending this America at the Crossroads program, from judge and community advocates. We appreciate it very much. We've got about 30 seconds. If you just want to tack something on as a closing thought before I share what events we have coming up next.
Well, again, thank you for this opportunity, and my thanks to everybody, again, associated with this series. I think there is hope in our democracy. I think the fact that 150 million people showed up to vote in this last election and were willing to exercise their power to vote tells me that deep down, for all of our differences, people understand the most important power we have, which is the power to vote and determine who our leadership is. And while I recognize that there's a lot of polarization and divisions within our society, I still believe that there is a fundamental spirit in this country that brings all of us together in order to protect this great country. I saw it in the eyes of the men and women in uniform that served this country, put their lives on the line to protect this country. I think we have to follow their example and hopefully work together under a new president to make sure that our democracy is there, not just for ourselves, but for our children.
Secretary Panetta, thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's been a terrific conversation, and there'll be another outstanding conversation next Tuesday night. Just a reminder that the weekly programs move next week to Tuesday, still at 5 o'clock. David Lehrer of Community Advocates, Inc. will be in conversation with a large panel of civil rights leaders representing a variety of different communities. You don't want to miss it. They'll be talking about the most important civil liberties and civil rights issues that the nation is dealing with. That program is titled After 4 Years of Division, Tension, and Bigotry, Now What? That's Tuesday, 5 o'clock, and make sure that you RSVP for that. Then the following week, on Wednesday, December 23rd, back to Wednesday, December 23rd, after 4 years of Trump, Can We Be Healed is the conversation, and it'll be New York Times. Brent Stevens will be in conversation, Brett Stevens, with the former LA Times reporter, Henry Weinstein. That's coming up again Wednesday, December 23rd. My thanks to Judge and to community advocates for inviting me to be part of this and for putting on this outstanding weekly series. We hope you've enjoyed it, and we hope you'll be back next Tuesday for the next one in the series. Have a very good evening and a very happy Hanukkah.